To everyone. This is our luncheon discussion of remote teaching for disability, stress, and unforeseen circumstances. I'm delighted to have you all here. The quarter is approaching rapidly, and I'm glad to see that people are still working on upgrading their skills and thinking about how to approach teaching in this new environment. I should first introduce myself. Most of you know me, but I'm Jim Sparrow. I'm the Master of the Social Sciences Collegiate Division, where I'm responsible for the Social Sciences core, the CIVs, and other parts of the undergraduate curriculum in the social sciences. I'm also on the history faculty, and I taught a course this spring that I think I'm grateful I was teaching in the spring so that I could see what the challenges are, and they're considerable, but they can be overcome. With us today is Ada Palmer, my colleague in the history department. She also has many other affiliations, the classics department, medieval and Renaissance studies. And Anne Henly, who's a senior lecturer and director of undergraduate studies in psychology, and is also the co-chair of the mind sequence in the Soc core. So thank you, Anne and Ada, for joining us. Before we start this conversation, I just want to make it really clear to everyone who's in this meeting that there are two resources that are essential for you to have at the ready whenever you're teaching, regardless of whether it's a COVID quarter or not, and that you should be always contemplating whether or not you need to access these resources when complications arise in class. The first one is the student advisors, the students' advisors in the college, which are listed on the registrar's site. So if you go to registrar.uchicago.edu and you load the course, they will provide, that webpage will provide a list of students in your class, enrolled in your class, and the email address for their advisor in the college. And so if a student is having some kind of difficulty across a range of things, not only stress or disability or unforeseen circumstances, but other questions having to do with managing workload, or if there are any ethical questions having to do with plagiarism or those kinds of things, anything that a college advisor should take under consideration, that's where you can quickly pursue this student's situation. And that you may not know what's going on in that student's life, but the college advisors actually do have a decent sense of what's going on, and they tend to be quite responsive. So I think that's an important resource to consider. The other resource is the Student Disability Services page, disabilities.uchicago.edu. And I think for anything pertaining to disabilities, that's your sort of first stop for just getting a sense of policy. And also, if you have any questions or uncertainty about accommodations, that will be the definitive source of information that we have available to the faculty. All right, so the way that these lunch discussions go is that we mainly run it like a brown bag lunch, a sort of Q&A style, where imagine we're all sitting around a seminar table eating our lunches. And so we're not going to do any presentations, but we're going to get right to your questions. So what I would ask is that anyone in the audience who has questions about the topic that we're taking up, please enter them in the chat feature of this Zoom meeting. And as they come up, then I'll actually ask you to ask your question personally, because I think it's just more conversational for us to do that. As we wait for people to enter their questions, I wonder if I could just ask Ada and Anne to just talk about how they've come to think about these issues of stress and disability, and maybe how their experiences in the spring bore on that. Maybe we could start with Ada.
Sure. I've been understanding what's been happening a lot through my disability activism work and my own personal experiences as a chronic pain sufferer. And especially over the course of the spring, as I was watching and hearing friends talk about their feelings of exhaustion, difficulties concentrating, difficulty sleeping that people are having, I realized that the symptoms of living through the emergencies that we're living through were very similar to the cognitive toll of chronic pain. And then doing more reading and looking into things, especially World Health Organization advice about this, confirmed that yes, a useful way to understand what's been happening is that stress, but especially anxiety, fear, are forms of pain. And waking up every day and having the world be a little bit wrong and a little bit strange and a little bit surreal and not quite the normal world causes the same or very similar damage day by day to the mind, to the nervous system that suffering pain over and over does. And one thing we know a lot about chronic pain is, for example, pain in the same place, affecting the same nerves over and over and over and over for weeks and months on end, ends up being much more damaging than much more severe pain once. You know, a kidney stone is extremely severe pain for a few days and then it's gone. Chronic pain is often milder pain, but forever, or over and over for a very long time. And that damages the highest cognitive function and makes it harder to understand reading, harder to articulate, harder to write, harder to use our second languages, harder to do mathematical calculations, harder to sleep, harder to do most of the things that we're here to do. And beginning by recognizing that the disruption to our daily lives of the world being a bit wrong, that fear, that waking up and seeing scary news every morning, those are having a cognitive toll which is accumulating. And when you look at FEMA's evaluations of disaster sites, a fascinating pattern that they find is, you know, a hurricane will hit a city, it'll be very devastating immediately. Then 4 to 5 months later, there'll be a huge spike in mental health problems in the population. Not immediately, there'll be some immediately, but there'll be a second spike much later when the world hasn't normalized, when the world still isn't back to being okay again and the cognitive toll has accumulated over time. We're beginning our quarter at that phase if you count from March to now. So you want to begin by approaching this from the point of view that this is a world mental health epidemic, in addition to being a world viral epidemic, that you and every single person in your classroom are under this cognitive load, although not necessarily quite articulating it, that it is normal to be breaking down, that there's no shame in breaking down, that everybody is going to be breaking down, but that the best things are to prepare for that, acknowledge that you'll be shorter tempered, acknowledge that sleep will be harder, plan accordingly, develop strategies for self-care and think about it as being a normal problem and not a special problem. It's not you breaking down. It's not shameful. It's just everyone should be self-monitoring. Everyone should be planning and everyone should be taking extra steps and remembering that no one on earth is operating at 100% right now. We're all operating at a max of 75% of our normal capacity to cope, rest, and operate. And I'd love to hear, I'll pause there for now, and I'd love this to go back and forth with you.
Yeah, you know, thank you, Ada. I want to just point out to the audience, I'm going to share the screen here, and I'd like to just share this webpage that we've put together that has a guide that Ada produced. So this is the social sciences teaching webpage at college.uchicago.edu/academics/social sciences teaching. And among the resources that are available on this website, we have a section called Planning for Student Success. And so there are a number of resources here that are I think, quite helpful. There's also, and Ada is listed as a content expert because she's helped us build so many of these resources. But there's also a section on self-care. And Ada, you wrote a guide on self-care for your students that I found really helpful. And I think one very effective way to think about what the students are going to need is to be a little more reflective and less masochistic about your own needs.
Yeah.
And as you start to think about, like, what's realistic for me to do in this context, you start to cut a break for the students too. And what I mean by that is that it's easy, especially I think as instructors, to feel like, all right, this is the University of Chicago. This has just got to be the best possible educational experience. And we're under these adverse circumstances where it's online. How can I make this amazing? And I can tell you that in the spring, time and again, there were many instructors who went, above and beyond the call of duty, which was great. But in doing it, they created more work for themselves and for their students out of inexperience, because they weren't experienced with the ramifications of moving things around and changing requirements so much, so that both the students and the instructors felt totally maxed out. And the survey results showed that both consistently said they were working much harder than they normally do. And so I think some of this is smart design, that you sort of reverse engineer and say, what can you reasonably do? What can you humanely do to yourself? And maybe that's too high a bar. You still have to take it down a notch for the students. But for the students, I think maybe being a little more in touch with what they get stressed out about. Ambiguity in the syllabus, for example, is one of the great sources, especially in this context where there are new circumstances and people don't know what expectations are. So I do think it's helpful to start with some of these resources and just kind of reflect on how this new context is creating strains on you as well as on your students. I'd also like to ask Anne if she has anything she wants to share with her experience from the spring or from what she knows from psychology.
Sure. Yeah, I am a cognitive psychologist and I do study learning. So I guess if we think about disabilities and accommodations for disabilities, those have been designed, and the reason I'm bringing up disabilities is because that's part of one of the foci of this meeting, right? And in the context of that, we think about those accommodations as accommodations for what we typically experience in the classroom, right? So what students typically might need if they have a disability, and that disability has been assessed as needing as requiring or being able to be cause them difficulties in the classroom. But now we have a situation that is very, very different than that. And so I think rather than thinking solely about accommodations and thinking about how we can accommodate students with disabilities, I think, as Ada and Jim have said, we might want to think about a much wider range. Disabilities are usually diagnosed for an individual and are thought of as a mental or physical handicap of that individual. They're not thought of generally as more situational. And now we have a much, much broader way of thinking about things that might be specific to an individual and an individual situation that go far beyond attention deficits, that go far beyond mental or physical kinds of disabilities, and have to do with things like their home situation, have to do with things like people who in their family that might be ill, have to do with their technology support, have to do with the way they typically socialize and are used to learning. And so all of these much broader range of things that may affect the way students learn are things that we haven't typically thought about or don't typically take into consideration when we're thinking about what quote unquote accommodations we need to make for people in our classroom. So I think that it's really important in this particular situation that we're in today to actually do two things: the accommodations that students who have been diagnosed with a disability, those accommodations may not apply at all in the current learning environment. They may not need those accommodations. They may not need any. They may need others. And all kinds of people who haven't been diagnosed with any kind of disability per se are going to need a whole range of accommodations that the disabilities office doesn't typically deal with. So in one sense, I think we just need to expand our notion of what are the kinds of impediments to learning in this environment, right? Because they're going to be a different set of impediments. And then, so that's one thing. I think we need to just think much more situationally about what kinds of things might intervene or interfere with the way students are going to learn, and recognize that that's going to be a very broad set of things. Secondly, I think thinking about what Jim was saying about our own experiences and how we deal with ourselves, that's a good starting point, but I would actually caution that our experiences as faculty and teachers and adults who are at a certain point in our life where we have a lot of resources, or we've learned to figure out how to make use of the resources we have, we're in a really different place than our students are. And so I think our insights into ourselves and what we need are a great place to start, but I don't want to think of my students that way, because I think they're actually in a very different situation than we are. And I think it's important to hear how to find out what is causing, and as Jim said, open up channels of communication with your students, because the things that are causing them a problem may not be those things that are causing us a problem, right? They're probably very, very different things. Some of them will be the same. So what that means is kind of having a bit of epistemic humility about the situation that our students face, not making judgments, as we very often do. We very often make judgments about somebody's situation, and it's quite natural to do so. But to recognize that what we know about their home situation, or what we know about their personal situation, or what we know about what their resources are to handle that is extremely limited. And the only way to overcome that is to try and talk to them directly about it, rather than say, oh, that's a problem for Student Disabilities Accommodations Office, go talk to them. Well, in this particular case, it may be something that is easier and more effectively dealt with you one-on-one.
And I want to just chime in on this point, which I think is really important. First of all, you're absolutely right. We shouldn't be projecting our own needs onto anyone else. But secondly, I think it's important to recognize, just on a kind of a ethical, procedural, legal basis, we also can't be inquiring into people's disabilities. So, but I think that actually provides an opportunity to talk about obstacles rather than framing them as disabilities. Just to talk to students about what are some of your concerns about your ability to access this course in a way that will allow you to really excel. And that allows the students to raise what they're worried about. And it may be that one person's worried about, you know, video for a reason that has to do with bandwidth, and another person's worried about video that has to do with visual processing. And it really doesn't matter to you as an instructor what those differences are. All that matters is, well, if you're going to rely on an hour and 20 minutes of live video conversation, that's going to pose a problem for different people in your audience. And so it allows, I mean, this happens in computer technology a lot. Like if you have a Mac, you may have noticed there are all these settings and system preferences that originally were grouped under you know, sort of disability accommodations, but now are really just like enhanced features of the operating system that everyone uses. Many people watch movies with closed captions now, just because they can, not because they have a hearing issue. And on the Mac, there are all kinds of things that you can use that make the computer more useful for you: dictation, text to speech, etc. So treating it more as sort of like, how does the student access the course, and it's necessarily going through the different platforms that we're using, really changes the framing of it, I think, in constructive ways. It opens our eyes to the things that we take for granted in sort of, you know, in a live face-to-face classroom. Sorry to interrupt, Anne.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted to echo, and I certainly wasn't saying we shouldn't use our own insight. We just need to, I think you always start from your own insight. I mean, we start from a center of egocentric knowledge. That's the knowledge we have about things. So we always start there. It's important to reflect on, to consciously remember that, though. Otherwise, we don't consciously think about it, right? And think about things, how things might be different for somebody else. I just wanted to echo your point about asking students. So I just, as the co-chair of mine, we just directed, and this is something that, you know, I suggest all faculty or instructors do. We just directed all the people who are teaching in mind to reach out to students and ask them, you know, about, you know, first about their time zone, a number of different things. But one thing was just an open-ended question at the end. You know, do you want to talk to us if you envision there are any or anticipate any problems that you might have engaging in the class, given your situation, want to talk about those, please let us know about those. So just an open-ended question, which I think, and I've already gotten 2 responses of people who are going to have some difficulties given their living situation. So it will be difficult for them to find a place, not just to listen, but to be able to feel like they can speak freely and participate in a discussion classroom, right? So that they have a quiet room to do that. So I think, you know, just very simple things like reaching out to people ahead of class time so that they know that you're aware of this is also really important.
Expanding on that, because I think we're moving toward it. So universal design is when you design into something in advance, something that's already pre-designed to offer all of the breadth of accommodation that's needed without people needing to make a special request. So a hotel with universal design is a hotel that builds ramps in automatically. A hotel without universal design is a hotel that didn't build ramps in, but you can call in advance and then the hotel staff will get a ramp and set it up for you specially, but you have to do these extra steps to get the thing to be there. And similarly, a syllabus with universal design is a syllabus that already has worked into it flexibility, alternatives, breadth, various features that are designed to anticipate needs and make it so that there is already a alternate assignment if you can't do this. There is already a built-in, if my video fails and I can't do the video, what do I do element, so that whatever the second feature is automatically there in advance, especially because whoever needs that special accommodation, whether that person needs it because of a disability or whether that person needs it because right before class there was a power outage where they are, is going to be the person who has the least extra time to lose asking for special stuff because they've already lost time to whatever made them not be able to do the thing in the first place. A useful way to think about universal design is often to reverse the focus we use from problem to outcome. So often when we're thinking about accommodation, we're thinking about what is the problem? The problem is the wheelchair. What is the problem? The problem is the ADHD. What is the problem? The problem is the power outage. And then what is the automatic thing that you do to accommodate that thing? Well, you make sure there's a ramp, etc. Focus it the other way. What is the need? The need is all the students need to be able to get the content that was in the lecture. Some of the students will be able to do this by watching it live. Some of the students won't. What can we set up that is an alternative for the students who won't, that's accessible to them, whatever the reason was? Is it that we record it and make it available at another point? That'll help for some, but not for the ones for whom the video is the problem. Is it that we make a transcript and make the transcript available afterward? If we want to grade discussion class participation and some people can't participate in the discussion for a variety of reasons, can we build in an alternative form? One thing that I always do in my courses and that the ADA recommends if you're grading class participation is to say, if you didn't participate in a class, afterward you can email me a paragraph of your thoughts about the class and what you would have said if you were able to participate in the class, and you'll get full credit as if you did participate in the class. And any student can use that for any reason. A student who has a disability related reason to not speak up in the class can use it. A student who has a cultural reason that makes it difficult to interrupt a discussion can use it. A student who was up all night in an emergency because their sister is sick and they were nursing her and is just too exhausted to coherently talk, but, you know, watch the discussion, can also use it. They can use that no matter what the reason was for not participating in the class. And that's an example of universal design, of building in advance this kind of flexibility. Thinking, what are the things the students want from this class? How can I design the class in advance to have that flexibility? One of the things I'm doing in my autumn lecture course is offering multiple different assignment tracks. And the sort of basic one is they write a short paper every week. A short paper is a great match for our limited ability to concentrate. Writing at high levels is one of the skills that really suffers when you're stressed out. And if you have a large due date where a huge portion of the grade rests on one thing that's due on one day, if there's an emergency around that time, that can have a big impact. So I've had, you know, just a short paper each week be the bulk of the grade for that course. Or there's an alternative, which is writing a term paper for those students who have a reason to want to write a term paper because they need a paper for grad school applications, because they want to write a term paper as practice for a thesis the next year. So that the option is there, so that the students for whom writing a term paper, despite it being a very difficult time to do that, can choose to do it, feel empowered by having made the choice, and get that element of the course that they need. But the other students who don't have a strong reason to want to write a term paper at any given point can have a customized assignment that is designed for the lower, the more stressed out situation we're in. And I will end this by pointing out, writing concisely and writing at short lengths is itself a really important skill, as we know from having to write abstracts or short proposals or cut our articles down to length. It's not as if we are lowering the bar for what students are learning by having them do short papers instead of a long paper. We're just changing it to focus on honing extremely valuable skills, which are valuable skills we can hone more effectively right now with shorter spans of concentration, but nonetheless high levels of quality output, as opposed to sticking with the medium we would automatically have used in a normal time and not adjusting it to suit what are we going to be able to teach most effectively now, as opposed to what would we normally teach if we were pretending that there isn't a crisis.
Of course, another goal will be getting students to write long, complicated, demanding texts. But it sounds like what you're saying, Ada, is that there are ways to allow students to work toward that without making it a make or break, all or nothing, end of the quarter, giant psychic explosion that can easily be disrupted by family illness or you name it.
Right. Another way is to break a term paper down and have,
right.
you know, a couple pages of it due each week, or, you know, the bibliography at this stage, et cetera, so that it's multiple grades over time instead of one grade at one moment, which is just so hard to recover from if that's a disaster, right? If that particular day is a disaster.
And this is just true more generally, right? That students learn better when they're getting steady, even if it's not as voluminous feedback. And so they know that they're on track or they're not. And likewise, it helps them think about how the pieces add together. So regardless of the context of stress, this is just helpful for thinking about pedagogy. So Shannon has a question about fostering discussion, and I think let's take it up in this context of sort of stress and being online. Shannon, I don't know, would you like to word this in any particular way beyond just sort of fostering discussion more generally?
I just, I'm used to teaching in a classroom environment where there's camaraderie that's built over the course of a quarter, and students are able to see each other eye to eye. And I've had discussions with colleagues where we've felt that the Zoom environment makes you feel like you're having maybe one-on-one conversations, maybe when you're not, and that can be misleading. And I'm just wondering, has anyone explored various techniques and trying to recreate that, or thinking about alternative methods where you can foster a good discussion, as that tends to be the sort of the basis of a lot of our classes.
We took this up in our last meeting. I don't know if Anne or Ada want to address this. It's a more general sort of pedagogy question. For me,
Anne, do you?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to address this. At least, so a couple of different things. Can people hear me?
yes.
Okay. So one thing is just to harken back to discussion and kind of the substitutability of different assignments for different goals. Of course, it depends on your goal for discussion. So sometimes one of the goals, and certainly in a course like mine, one of the goals of the course is to help students be able to engage communicatively with ideas and process those ideas and process somebody else's ideas and respond to them both in the moment, to present their own ideas, to be able to engage another in discussing those ideas. Those are actually learning goals for the class. How do we present evidence? So I'm not certain that it's always, and sometimes it's not going to be possible to pursue certain goals in certain environments. So, you know, if it's completely asynchronous, you're not going to have those kinds of discussions. But certainly, as Ada was saying, students may find it much more difficult to attend discussions regularly in this environment. And so if you still want to maintain the goal of the learning criteria that you have, and it's not really about grading so much, it's about their active engagement with people in a discussion that is the learning, the source of the learning, and you want to maintain that. I think there are ways to foster that, which are actually important in regular classroom settings too. And I think the important thing is to help prepare students to engage in a discussion by doing things before they come into the classroom, even if it's a remote classroom where you're synchronously Zooming together, having them talk to other students beforehand via either setting up small groups to work together during the week on a certain kind of question that you could give them, or putting questions and responses, having students respond on a discussion board to those kinds of things, and then come into the joint synchronous Zoom with particular ideas in mind for how they're going to discuss, breaking up into smaller groups, to have students in breakout rooms, to have students talk about an idea. But I don't ever do that without giving them a very clear-cut goal of what needs to get done in that discussion in their breakout session. Not just what they're going to talk about, but what product they're going to be bringing back to the larger group, right? So go talk about this, and then when you come back, this is what we'll do as a group to integrate or to coordinate that. So they not only have something to talk about, but they have, you know, the end goal, the outcome of what's supposed to go on there, and how they're going to report back to the group. I think it's changing I think you need to introduce variation in what the task is in discussion, and not leave things completely open-ended. Oh, we're going to talk about the readings. What did you think of the readings? That's really open-ended, and it makes it much, much harder, even in a Zoom context. I think it's much, much harder for students to jump in and start that. So I think that kind of puts the onus on us as instructors, or at least I have found the discussions are more successful if in advance I create at least areas of questions that I think would be worthwhile for students to explore. I don't give them specific questions necessarily. I might give them different tasks or different ways of approaching the material. In terms, Shannon, of your question about creating more of a discussion with multiple people rather than having, Zoom has this feeling of, I'm talking at one person now, and then the next person is going to talk at you, rather than having a conversation between many people. I don't know how to deal with that. Actually, we did try some different things about organizing the discussion around one particular question and having people raise their hand at a particular point in time if they were wanting to engage and respond to what that person was saying at that moment, rather than people raising their hands because they wanted to introduce a different topic, right? So that is often the way the Zoom things go. You can't really see what the person is going to be introducing, and they introduce a completely different topic. And it's easier to recover from that in a live discussion when you're there in person. So developing a system. So, okay, we're going to, use raise hand for changing the topic. But if you have a comment on what people are going to talk about now, then do something else, right? So that makes it a lot easier to try and have a conversation that doesn't just jump all over the place. But it still is difficult for it to end up feeling like several people, 18 to 20 people, are involved in a conversation. It is a lot like talking at you. So I'd love to hear what other people have to say for how they manage that.
Yeah, I could expand with a couple of examples and also a couple of results of student feedback. So for breakout room discussions, absolutely agreeing with Anne, they work well, but they need specific structure. So for example, you might say, we're discussing Hobbes's Leviathan, now we're going to break into breakout rooms. Each breakout room is going to have a example of a one-page essay from the period that somebody wrote in response to Leviathan, and they're unique, different ones. And you need to discuss how you feel about that period response to Leviathan. And then when you come back, you have to talk about that to the other students who haven't read that one-page essay. They read a different one. So it's a very clear goal and then reintegrate. And that can help a lot. Another thing that can help a lot is overarching discussion structures. So for example, a thing I sometimes do when I'm doing an ancient philosophy intro is the students get divided up by sect. And these 4 students are Epicureans, and these 4 students are Stoics, and these 4 students are Platonists. And it means that they always have a specific lens from which to jump in on a topic. And they always feel like they can say, but Plato would say blah to this thing. And it feels a little bit like a team or like a debate. And that can also make it feel as if it can make participation flow a lot better. Our responses from students in the spring indicated that they found group discussions of 5 to 12 participants worked best. That larger than that, people started feeling lost. And many students reported that faculty offered what are being called town hall office hours, where you say, I'll be on Zoom in this period, and if you want to come ask a question, you can join, and there other students will be there too. You'll see each other, you'll hear each other's questions, and we'll have a small casual outside of class discussion in the office hours. Many students reported that those were their favorite part of the quarter in the spring, that those were even better than any of the classes that they took, because it offered those small group conversations, which tell us that the breakout room structure is a very good one. And also that it's a great time for group projects. Students often groan over group projects because it pulls them away from the social stuff they would be doing. But here the situation is opposite. It creates a social thing for the students to be doing, especially for first-year students who are meeting new groups of people. A group task, a group project, a group presentation, a group paper, especially if it lets some groups mix around but other groups stay constant through the quarter, can provide those small group, intimate, face-to-face conversations that are very therapeutic as well as very constructive and good at fostering discourse. So students have responded very positively to those, whether it's within the class or outside of it, with the proviso that if it's outside, remember you're adding to the total amount of time you're asking students to spend on the course. So you need to shorten other parts of the course to make up for it. One of the problems students experienced last spring was that workload went way up when courses flipped, because suddenly they're watching 3 hours of filmed lecture in addition to going to 3 hours of class discussion and also having a separate discussion section outside. And yet the written assignments and readings wouldn't reduce to compensate. So if you're doing something like flipping, moving the lecture outside of class time, etc., you need to remember that that also increases the load, and you therefore need to make either the written or reading components of that course less time consuming, not necessarily less rigorous, but less time consuming, in order to keep the load okay and not be accidentally increasing the workload at the very moment that it's hardest for people to keep up with that workload.
It's really clear that flexibility is key here. And that's been a theme of this exchange. Lara asked a question about flexible options for assignments. I don't know if Lara would like to chime in now on that.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is going back to, Ada, what you were talking about with building in, kind of having everything have a +1 option.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm mindful of trying to scaffold assignments so that there are, you know, periodic deadlines that help build towards those larger assignments. But the tension that I'm trying to balance is having some flexibility built in for students for missing certain deadlines, but at the same time, I'm still so overwhelmed by the quarter system and how fast it goes by. And it's so easy when students do start to get behind on some of these deadlines to really fall behind in the course. So do you have suggestions for balancing the flexibility on the one hand for what students may be going through one particular week or another, with making sure that they're really staying on track to succeed in the course and not fall too far behind?
Anne, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think this happens whether we're talking about Zoom or not Zoom. This is an issue. And I think in my experience, students differentially take advantage of and feel entitled to reaching out to faculty. So many students will not do well no matter what how often you say, please come see me if you have any questions. Students, or if you're having trouble with X, Y, and Z, they don't know they're having trouble with X, Y, and Z until they're in the middle of it, or they're avoiding having trouble with X, Y, and Z. So I think the best way to deal with that is to meet with students. I mean, I don't know how big your classes are, but to set up times to actually meet with students to see how they're doing on a project of that kind, to have those meetings scheduled with that student in advance and understand what products are supposed to be, you're going to be talking about at that point in time, whether it's meeting with a group or whether it's a group of 2 to 3 students who are working on something. But waiting for students to tell you if they've fallen behind is on a quarter system, in my experience, doesn't work, except for those students who are going to do really well anyways, and those students who are going to reach out to you anyways. So it's those students who need more help, I often find, don't reach out. So I tend to put into structure the class such that they have to meet with me or they have to meet with the TA to do the next thing. So not only do I get to keep up on where they are in that case, but I get a sense of who they are, meet with them outside of class, have a much more informal meeting, and get to hear individually how they're doing. And these are things I think many students, if I don't do that, I don't see them. They don't come to my class unless I do that, or to my office hours. Hopefully they come to my class, but maybe not that too. So that's my solution to that.
You've reminded me of a fascinating recent study that showed that this was not specific to Chicago, it was universities broadly. A fair number of students misunderstand what office hours mean and think that office hours mean the professor is in their office, it's reserved for them to work in their office, and this is when you're not allowed to contact them. And so people are recommending calling them student hours instead, which is clearer that this is the time that is intended for students. A fascinating misnomer question that I'd never thought of. Going to Lara's question about scaffolded projects, you know, this problem where if a student is doing a thing where it's a term paper and it's got grades due every week and they miss a bunch, you can get to a point where recovery isn't possible. This was thrown into very stark relief for me 2 years ago when I was doing one of the Teach with Wikipedia systems, which is great, and students love the idea that they're contributing knowledge that's going to be seen all over the world. But the Teach with Wikipedia system does genuinely require you to do a step each week, and if you don't do them, you can't recover at the end. You can't cram them all in. And we had a number of students who were just blindsided by the fact that there wasn't a way to suddenly make up for having done none of the work all quarter. That they assume there will be a way to make up for having postponed all the work to the end. Now, in some sense, that's on that student. But in another sense, at that point, if the answer is there's no option, then you just have sort of despair and a sour feeling at the end. If the answer is there is an option, it's going to be a hell of a lot of work, but you have to, but there is a way, then they make the choice to either not do that extremely difficult work and accept the F which they earned, or to do it. So what we ended up doing with that was, okay, if you did this so you can't complete the Wikipedia thing, you'll get credit for any Wikipedia stuff you did along the way. Meanwhile, you now have to write the long paper that the other track was doing, and to make up for what you didn't do, you have to do the extra credit assignment. But that if you do those things, you can still pass the course. And of the 5 students that we offered that to, 2 of them did it, 1 of them did half of it, and the other 2 chose not to. And I think that's a much better outcome than just telling them at that point that they're sunk. For accommodating things like emergencies and so on, what I've done for this year is, when breaking down those framework assignments, broken them down into 1 fewer chunks than there are weeks, so that the answer is you get to miss one of these and make it up in the week that there isn't one due, right? And so it means students will be sometimes 1 week out of sync with each other, which makes discussing the progress of the term paper harder. But it does mean that there is that flexibility that, you know, the term paper has been broken down into having 7 subcomponents, and they're due over 8 weeks. And one of those weeks you skip turning in a component, you turn in that component the next week, and it flows and has that extra little bit of flexibility built into it. That's worked well.
I'm glad you brought up this point of how you sort of make the flexibility structure so that it can accommodate disruption. This is sort of the third leg of the stool of this conversation, and I want to make sure we get to it. Gina asks about, Owen Cole asks about planning for the unforeseen. And I think this includes not only what might befall the students, they might become sick, someone in their family might become sick, you know, there might be any number of reasons why their participation might be disrupted, but the instructor may also fall sick, or the whole country may be thrown into civil tumults, unfortunately, or there may be wildfires in the western third of the country, or any number of other biblical plagues may fall upon. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about you know, planning for disruption in, you know, more generally. And if, Owen, if you have any aspect of that question you want to put an edge on to, please turn your mic off and jump in.
Thank you very much for all of these tips and for organizing. I think you did a great job of summarizing, Jim, and you know, I guess I'm, in a certain sense, I'm echoing the question mark in your course title, the Democracy in America, you know, and thinking about exactly what November will look like. And I just, you know, I'm sort of thinking, I mean, among other things that I've heard, you know, people assigning a documentary for class on November 3rd. It's ideas of this sort that I was kind of thinking of. And I was also thinking of my students in the spring, where there were cases of people facing, let's say, unforeseen circumstances with the city authorities. So that's the sort of thing that was on my mind.
And before Anne and Ada answer, I just want to point out that the college is reverting to its normal grading policies. So in the spring, we had a special policy that made it easier for students to petition to switch to pass-fail. And the college is not continuing that policy. It's returning to the traditional approach. Now, that doesn't mean that students can't petition, and we still pursue the principle of instructor discretion. So you're all, you're the experts in your course, and so you can decide what you think indicates successful completion of work for your course. So there's still, there are many ways to skin a cat and indicate to your students their progress and satisfying the requirements of the course. But unlike last quarter, we will not have that sort of the default that the students felt like they could, count on just taking a pass-fail if everything just went crazy. So I think that actually puts more of an onus on us to think about how to accommodate disruption within the framework of our requirements in our classes. I don't know if Anne or Ada want to talk about just planning for disruption more generally. Ada's already begun some of that. There are all kinds of logistical ramifications that—
Anne, do you want to go first?
Sure. I guess I think I don't have a clear answer to planning it all out in advance. I think it really, for me, expecting there to be disruption and having a clear idea of myself of what I think I want students to be learning in this class, having clear learning goals for the class, and thinking about how those goals are going to be met given this disruption. Given that we might have a presidential election and that people, all kinds of things that might overwhelm, if we think about the spring and what might overwhelm different individuals differently, actually, and have different consequences for different groups of people in our class, taking that into consideration, not to say, oh, it's okay that you don't do this work or you don't learn X, Y, and Z, but thinking about what you do want them to learn from the course and how you might adjust, how I might adjust or think about how the situation maybe presents an opportunity to learn something a little bit different that I hadn't planned on, but basically fits into the concept of the course. So I think it involves, I guess the way I would approach your question, besides thinking about the individual situation, is thinking about my own goals for the course and being flexible and thinking about how disruptions may present opportunities for students to learn, for me to get students to learn things I hadn't thought about, right? And how they relate to the ongoing events in the world. So that puts a huge onus on us as teachers to not just do the same thing that we're always doing, but to be thinking about how we can incorporate the state of the world, which is impinging on us right now, into the classes that we're teaching. And certainly I'm thinking about teaching mind, which is really a course on, underlying psychological processes and phenomenon for students. And there are all kinds of ways that I can think that what's going to be happening in the world is something that could get incorporated into our discussions and into how we think about the material in the class. I don't know if that's the same for chemistry. I think it probably isn't. So I think it really depends on what it is your teaching goals are, and how you can flexibly incorporate disruptions in the world into the class in a way that helps students learn from those disruptions. So
Larissa Jasarevic added to this that she's concerned about being able to accommodate students who have anxieties or vulnerabilities and get them to the expertise that they need. And I think there, the college advisors are going to be an important channel for that. The other thing is that, obviously we can't plan for all of this, but we do need to be prepared for some pretty large-scale disruptions. I mean, the governor of Illinois just called out the National Guard because the Breonna Taylor decision is going to come down sometime in the next few days. So that's a very large scale of disruption, and that's just this week. We've got to get all the way through the fall quarter. So for me, one of the ways I anticipated and was able to incorporate some flexibility was just being more asynchronous, having more of the course function even if it was knocked out temporally, so that, using online platforms that don't require live interaction, and then accommodating disruptions with, flexible meetings. But, if you have a larger course, that there's a limit to how flexible you can be. So maybe building into the structure of requirements a sort of substitutability of different kinds of assignments. It really depends on your class.
If I can address a couple of facets, both of what you just said, Jib, and also of what Anne said. So first, on the question of how to help students who need more expert help go get it. It's not our job directly, but one really great way that helps with many other things as well is if you show vulnerability, you talk about being under stress, you talk about not functioning at full capacity, and especially if you talk about going to get help, whether it's an anecdote about the past or whether it's a story about the present. And because often to students, we put on this facade of iron strength because we're trying to push through and make things flow well, which also then creates the illusion that somehow the faculty are superhuman, which is a very common kind of perception among students. When we show vulnerability, we make it feel much more okay to be vulnerable and to have problems. And if it's something as simple as you saying, all right, it was a stressful weekend, I had trouble sleeping last night too, but let's do this because it's important. The more you do that, the more likely a student is to believe that it's okay to have a problem and to seek help for it. So it may not be in any way a direct intervention with a student who has a problem and needs help. In fact, you may never even know that a particular student that did. But every time we discuss that, show that, talk about having imposter syndrome, talk about having stress, talk about messing up, talk about doing self-care, giving them a role model who isn't perfect is incredibly valuable to students being comfortable with acknowledging that they also aren't perfect and need to go get help of various sorts, whether that help is a restful night or whether that help is going to get a professional to help. So that's a key thing that I definitely want to urge everyone to do. And it's amazing how much students open up and are deeply moved by having a major role model that they look up to admit weakness and imperfection. It's very, very powerful. As for the question of disruption, and especially the question of November, when I was a starting TA, one piece of concrete advice I got that was really helpful was a person saying there are two circumstances in which you should just give up in class. If these things happen in class, just no student will be able to concentrate. One is if there's a bee in the classroom, or another creature more distracting than a bee, like a squirrel or a cat or a raccoon. Just it'll be so distracting that none of what's happening in class will sink in. Your lecture will go by, but it will not register. The better choice is to stop, deal with the bee, no matter how long it takes, even if it means eating up 15 minutes of class, and then have an abbreviated class after the bee is dealt with. And I think we can compare disasters to that because it's not that you can fix the disaster, but it's that everyone will be thinking about the disaster or the disruption until you acknowledge it. So for example, I will never forget a history lecture that I was attending on the day of 9/11. And the lecturer, as we all arrived, and it had happened shortly before the lecture, and we all came in a sort of stunned, not understanding what was happening yet situation. And he prefaced the lecture with a sort of 6-minute, something that we don't understand has just happened that's clearly going to be a major turning point for our nation and for politics for the next while, and that is scary and that is violent. And yet here you are, participating in higher education, empowering yourselves, carrying on this tradition of universal education and feeling that education produces powerful citizens, and powerful citizens are the most important way we have to combat fear and tyranny. And he just gave a 5-minute little speech about how by being at that lecture, we were doing something great that does address not specifically what had just happened, but the evils of the world more broadly. And then he plunged into the lecture, and it was such a cathartic and powerful experience, and we were able to concentrate because he had addressed what had happened. And so similarly to what Anne was saying about think about what the learning outcome goals are for a class. If you have a class on election day or the days after, because with so many mail-in ballots, it would be amazing if we actually had a result the first night. So this is going to be multiple days of not knowing what's happening and tension. If your class is one that's focused on getting across factual information, right? They have to learn this amount of facts in order to be ready for the 202 level of this thing. We do have to get through this information. Then if you have class that day, preface it with that kind of speech and then address the information, but it's in a way that the student can then connect to what they're feeling. If on the other hand, you'll be teaching a course like the one I will be teaching that day, which is on the history of European thought leading up to the Enlightenment, I'm just having them read Thomas Paine's Common Sense and say, we're going to talk about the theory of democracy in America and what its ideas were and make the discussion be about today and also about the material and about synthetic reflection on what it means to be a citizen and the way being a citizen and education intersect. Many classes will be able to do that. Most core, humanities or core social sciences courses could do that. Other courses won't be able to do that because you really do have to memorize these molecule formulas in order to move on to the next thing, or you really do have to learn these historical figures and dates to move on to the next thing. A preface can help enormously and turn concentration, being distracted by that B in the classroom, to the equivalent of getting the B out of the classroom. So that's my recommendation.
All right, well, I am going to end it on that upbeat note before we fall back down into despair, thinking about the fall, that we're going to carry the standard of learning aloft in these dark times. We've come to the end of the hour. I want to thank our panelists for their thoughts and their contributions, and thank you all for thinking about this, and of course, get in touch with us if you have follow-up questions. But thanks for a good conversation. Have a good day.
Thank you.